In 2023, we started planning, recording, editing, and uploading the Sam Oldham podcast. By the end of this year, we will have recorded our 50th episode, an achievement that myself and Sam are really proud of. We've had the opportunity to sit down and talk to some amazing people, and they've been kind enough to share some incredible stories. In this episode, I explore some of the videos and the episodes that resonated the most with our social media following. I'm going to talk about the key messages that I took away, what I learned from their stories, why I think it resonated with people, and also what those guests have been up to since coming on the podcast. And this is my story. So the first person I'm going to talk about is the episode that I did with Dan Keatings, and I think it's probably one of my favourite. I've known Dan since I was a kid. He's an amazing guy, absolute gentleman, incredible athlete. And to hear his story, I think what I learned from sitting down with a lot of my friends that were former teammates and gymnasts was, however well I thought I knew their story, there was always a lot for me to learn. You know, at the time when I was competing with Dan or I was a teammate of his, I was inside my own head, living my own journey. And he had a lot of things going on. And one of the things that really struck me straight away was when I learned about the conversations he'd had around 2012. That was big for me, right? Because, you know, I'd explained to Dan on the podcast, and I've explained before in solo episodes that, you know, I felt quite guilty at the time at 19, feeling like I'd taken a place off Dan and maybe that I didn't deserve it. With what came after the Olympic Games, but listening to the story that he told about the conversation he had with the head national coach, and the head national coach at the start of the year saying to him, look, Dan, we think it's better if we rest you. We're not going to send you to the European Championships. We're going to rest you up for the Olympic Games. Give you a little bit more time. And then one of the other national coaches comes and kind of has that conversation with Dan and says, look, Dan, you know that if you don't go to the Europeans and they win a gold medal, you're not going to be on the team. And you know, straight away you kind of think about how important those conversations that people in positions of power are, that they have with you. And one thing it really taught me is when you're in a position like that and you're competing in at least elite sport, or even, you know, this would be, someone could resonate with this if they're talking about their workplace and they're having a conversation with their boss maybe about getting a pay rise or maybe moving up the company or their future. You have to be really, really really careful that you're not too trusting of those people, and you make sure that they can definitely make those decisions, because, you know, in that situation, potentially Dan would probably look back and say he was a little bit naive, you know, in thinking that that guy's telling him the truth. You know, ultimately, you know, that team went there, they won that gold medal. It was going to be then very difficult to take one of those athletes out of that team and put Dan back in. So, you know, I learned a lot from that situation. It's something that's happened to me. You know, it's those conversations I've heard take place, you know, when I shouldn't have done. But that was the big takeaway for me. It was making sure that you know, if you're in a situation where it's just your word against somebody else's and nobody else hears that, and it's a professional setting, there's a big decision that needs to be made, you know, be careful about that. Make sure you've got it written down. You know, I've had an experience very recently with someone close to me who's had a similar situation, you know, and she was explaining the conversation to me. I was listening to it and I was thinking, I hope you've got that written down in writing. And she didn't. And then it became very, very difficult to kind of argue your case at that point, because you're just trusting somebody's word. And, you know, like we all know, not everybody sticks to their word. And sometimes people have their hands tied and they can't, and they make promises that they shouldn't do and promises that they can't keep. I think that's something that's quite common within sport. People in those positions, whether it's national coaches or technical directors, people that make the decisions and are picking the teams, they sometimes make promises and say things they really shouldn't say. Because if you're an athlete and someone says to you, right, look, you keep working hard here, you have a good competition next week, you know, I could put you in that team, I'm going to take that as gospel, because that's what I want to hear. I want you, the guy that's making the decision, to be telling me that if I do that next week, you're going to put me in the team. You know, so that's a little bit of a life learning lesson. And for me, it really just, you know, I knew that anyway, but it really hit home. You know, it reminded me. So the next time a situation like that arises in my own life and somebody's making me these promises, you know, I take a step back and think, right, can this person deliver on that? And should I be taking this as gospel, or should I take it in? And if it does work out, amazing, but also be aware that, you know, that might not work out the way that I want it to in my head. And so that was a big learning lesson for me from that episode. And I think people resonated with that a lot out of Dan's story. And I think the key message for me that came out of Dan's story, to be honest, was just that it's always the right thing to do the right thing. And this was the thing that, you know, at 23 when I went through a similar experience to Dan in the Rio 2016 Olympic Games. The main thing that came out of that was, I was like, do you know what? Like, sports, medals, success, money, they're all super important. They are valuable, but there are other things in life that are more important. And doing the right thing and having a clear conscience and being happy that you've stuck to your morals and your principles and your values will always outweigh that 100%. And listening to Dan's story, and Dan was in a position where when he was an athlete, he felt that he didn't have a voice. He didn't feel like he was potentially at the time the athlete with the most leverage. There were other gymnasts at the time that had more medals and were winning more. So he kind of felt that he didn't have a voice and he couldn't, get his opinions across, or his opinions weren't valid. And they weren't validated because he wasn't the top guy. But actually when he retired, he started to understand his self-worth and his value a little bit more. And once he was retired, he kind of looked at the culture within gymnastics at the time. He saw that a lot of us were struggling. There was a contract dispute going on, and he decided at that point, do you know what? Like, I've got nothing to lose anymore. These people, they don't dictate my earnings, my salary, my career, my future. I'm outside of that now. I do have a voice, and it's going to help those guys if I come out and share my story. He did that. I said to him on the podcast, and I've said before, one of the bravest guys I've met. He was doing that on his own in 2018 when there was nobody else supporting him. He stood up, told his story. Subsequently, that led eventually to one of the head national coaches at the time losing their job. The contracts got resolved to some degree. Dan was a big hand in helping that. And now we see a different culture in gymnastics, and that then was probably one of the first dominoes that fell that led to the outcry of the kind of Me Too movement that existed within gymnastics during the pandemic. So yeah, Dan, amazing guy. Key message for me that came out of that I took away was, yeah, it's always the right thing to do the right thing, and you should stand up for what you believe in. It's important. It's important to stand for something, and yeah, that was probably the key message for me. One thing it got me thinking about, and I have thought about since, particularly this weekend. So I've been doing my gymnastics coaching level 3 qualification. I went there and I did my 3rd module, so I've done all the apparatus now, and it's just the practical side. So I've learned how to support the skills, how to teach the skills, and one thing that's really struck me recently is that when I talk to a lot of my friends that are in the gymnastics community and they're still coaching, most of the big clubs now are struggling for coaches. They can't find the coaches. There's not enough coaches going around. There's not enough coaches with a good level of expertise and knowledge. They're having to kind of hold a lot of these coaches that come in, they're almost having to walk them through the process of becoming more qualified, and they're trying to give them that experience, and it's hard. That's a long process. You've got to invest in someone. Sometimes the clubs have to fund the coaches' qualifications, and then there's no guarantee that they're going to stay in that club. They might go to that club, get their qualifications, and then go and start their own club. And one thing I've really noticed is that there's a gap. There's a gap in coaching. And when I think about Dan's story and the way that he was treated, that lack of empathy, not thinking about the future, and wait a minute, this guy's one of the best gymnasts in the whole country. He's done things that nobody's ever done before from Great Britain. We should try and encourage him to stay within the gymnastics community and share his knowledge when he's retired. In fact, Dan retired feeling pretty almost disfranchised from the system within British gymnastics at the time. So he isn't sharing his knowledge. He's not in coaching. And that is somebody that could have been filling this gap of coaches that we've not got right now, It's a perfect example of why short-term thinking is just not a good plan. You should really think for the long term. I've said this before, my whole generation, there are hardly any. We're talking, if you were looking at percentages, it might be less than 5% of those medalists are in coaching, giving back, sharing their experience, their knowledge. And they're the types of coaches that, yes, I think every single coach, regardless of the level you got to compete in, you should start from the bottom and you should learn the basic principles of coaching, communication. How do I work in a team? Can I engage with kids? How do I get kids to be excited about doing a forward roll and doing the basics? Like, how does that work? Everybody should learn that. But they do have an advantage when it comes to the experience and the knowledge because they did it for 20 years. And you could bypass some of that learning curve by bringing those gymnasts in and supporting them into their coaching journey. And that's just gone. And there's this big gap now. And all the big clubs in the country are struggling for coaches. And yeah, it's a shame. It's a sad thing. And I hope that in the future, the people within British gymnastics think about, right, these athletes that are coming to the end of their career, how can we make sure we look after them, we nurture them, and we encourage them to stay within the sport so we don't lose that knowledge? I think that's probably the big thing that came away from that conversation that I've been thinking about recently. I spoke to Dan. Dan's just started a new job. He says he's loving it, really enjoying it. He's getting ready for Christmas. He wants to take his son skiing lessons because he wants to take him skiing. The great thing about doing the podcast is that I get to catch up with old friends, and then I tend to stay in touch with them a little bit more, so that's been really cool. I saw that he met up for, it was Dan Purvis's birthday, so Dan Keating's, Christian Thomas, Dan Purvis, Frank Baines, they all met up, went out for Dan Purvis's birthday. Unfortunately, it was my brother's birthday on the same day, so I couldn't go, so I was gutted I couldn't be there. But it was just great to see my old teammates meeting up, because that's been one of the great things that's come out of this podcast. So for me, yeah, the Dan episode was brilliant, and I think it resonated with a lot of gymnastics fans, but other people as well. The next episode I'm going to talk about is the Max Hayes one. So Max was really cool, and I think the one thing that I took away and I learned about Max's story is that, you know, I think you've got kind of like two people out there. There are people within the industry that you work in, so in a career sense, that had it really tough. So they kind of feel that everybody else after them should have it really tough too, and they're not going to help anybody else. But there are equally a lot of people that it was really difficult for them to get to where they got to, and they're quite happy to help the next generation coming through. And that's what I learned from Max's story. Max told the story of lots of people that have helped him throughout his career, you know. It's been hard as well. He's had to do the graft. He started from the bottom. You know, he's this young kid that started a YouTube channel that, you know, didn't necessarily have any experience, and he's, you know, at times hassling people at 15, 16 for an interview, professional footballers and managers. And it's a great story of somebody that just has just forced their way into the situation that they're in, and they're doing really well. But for me, the big thing that I learned was about, yeah, there are people out there that are willing to help you if you look for them. And sometimes that means that you might get 10 rejections and 10 people that don't want to help you. But all you need is to find that one person that will say, do you know what? Like, when I was in your position, no one helped me out, so I'm going to help you out. And this is this person. I can give you his contact number, talk to this person, let me ring this person. You can come and shadow me, watch me for a bit, see how it works. And that was one thing I really took away from Max's story, that, you know, I'm not surprised that Max is doing really, really well. He's a brilliant communicator, and that came across on the podcast. He's amazing at telling his story, but it seems like he's really good at working with other people and finding the people that can help him. And yeah, it was brilliant to have learned that. Also very reassuring that there are people out there, because I think, you know, when you're doing your own little thing, you're in your own little world, at times you do feel like everybody's out for themselves and there's no good people here and there's no good guys around. But that's just not true, you know. Most of the time people are just so busy that they haven't got the time. But, you know, I tend to find when you go out and you ask people if they'll help you, people are more often than not, they're really willing to share their advice and share their knowledge and give you a helping hand. And that was really cool to hear that from Max's story. I think the key message I took away from Max's story, to be honest, was just one that's resonated with probably most of the guests that I spoke to, is that you only really see the tip of the iceberg. And it's the underside of that iceberg, which is the important stuff. And that's what nobody ever sees. You know, nobody ever sees the hours Max was editing his YouTube videos, or he was in his bedroom practicing in front of a mirror, pretending he's on TV or on the radio. Like, no one ever sees that. No one ever sees, like Max talked about, the job applications he sent in, and just the no's, rejections, or people just ignoring him. You don't see that. What you see is Max being very successful now and being on Sky Sports or TalkSport or being on BBC, or he's now just been given, he is now the host of the Gary Boldy-Red Nottingham Forest official podcast. Amazing, right? And that's happened in the space between coming on the podcast. So really cool to see that evolution for Max and to listen to his story. But the one thing I really took away from that, and I've taken that away from probably all of the guests, is it's that hard work. You can't cheat it. There's no secret. There's nothing. There's no magic trick. There's no one thing that all of these guys have that nobody has, that if you knew it, that's it. Overnight, you'd become a success. There is no secret. It's just graft, consistency, hard work, a lot of self-belief, but just keep moving. And more than anything, it's an ability, I think, to take the knocks, being able to take the rejections, and just being able to take 100 no's to get one yes. Are you willing to do that? You know, are you willing to email 100 people just to get one yes? A lot of people aren't. And I think that sets a lot of people apart. Certainly Max. You know, Max is a kid that Max is very young, right? And he's going into an industry where it's pretty ruthless and quite cutthroat. You know, you got this teenager coming in, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, thinking that he's going to now be the new kid on the scene. He's going to be the next kind of Jake Humphrey. Age isn't a barrier. It's tough. It makes it harder. But I think sometimes from speaking to all of my guests and having these conversations, particularly with athletes, it'll be a question you guys have heard me ask a lot of the time. I think being young that naivety is a massive advantage because you don't really appreciate or understand what it is you're getting yourself into. And I think that definitely helped for Max. And, seeing him be so successful at such a young age, he's still at university. I think he'll be going into he's in his second year of university now, I think. So he's 19 or 20 years of age, and he's hosting Nottingham Forest podcast. He's on Talk Sport all the time. He's on Sky Sports News. He's the guy that Sky Sports News go to if there's a story about Forest. He's on Talk Sport. Like, that's incredible for someone of that age. And I think the important thing, he's got a real level head on his shoulders. And, I remember from when I was a kid, the reason that all of my family are Man United fans was because they kind of bought to the idea that if you're good enough, you're old enough. It doesn't matter the age. And my granddad fell in love with the Busby Babes, and they were a young side. And Man United, growing up in the 90s, it was the class of 92, getting all those young kids onto the team. And, that was always great for me. I loved those stories because when I was a kid, I was always the kid. I always wanted to see myself as the underdog. And, it's no surprise then I went on to make my senior debut just at 17 and go to the Olympics at 19. So for me, the big thing I took away from Max is that age isn't a barrier, and that doesn't matter whether you're 19 and you're trying something new or you're in your 50s and you want to start something new and switch careers and pivot a little bit. I've got an experience of that at the moment currently within my family. Someone's going to have to do that. So it doesn't matter. Anybody can do that at any time, that was a big thing I took away from Max's episode. And like I said, what Max is up to now, he's hosting the Gary Boldy Red podcast, which is the official Nottingham Forest podcast that's just started. He's now a journalist, so he's super excited because every time there's a Forest match now, he gets to sit in the press section and ask questions. It's just really cool to see his journey and to be able to follow that as he moves along, kind of goes up in his career. I can't wait to watch that, and hopefully I'm sure our paths will cross again next year. I know Max played in a charity football match this summer, so I'm going to be messaging him next year asking him if he can get me in, because any chance I can get to play 11-a-side football, I'm going to take it. That was Max's episode. Again, brilliant. I had a lot of people actually message me about that one. Found it really interesting. It was the first time we had a journalist, as it were, on, and also to get that side of things, but also get a football take on things. A lot of people that are obviously gymnastics fans are also football fans, so that was cool. And then the next guest was Sophie Caldwell. And I think the thing I learned about Sophie's story straight away that really struck me was a conversation we had beforehand. It was really interesting for me how there are certain sports I'm starting to figure out that can make really good money. I was blown away by the type of money she was telling me that you could make. So it seems to typically be not in this traditional Team GB Olympic system and format. It seems to be these circuits and World Cup circuits that exist on the outside of that. I understand that because in gymnastics you have the Bundesliga in Germany, you have the French league and the Italian league. A lot of gymnasts from Europe and around the world will go and compete in these leagues and they'll make a bit of money on the side. But the type of money these guys were making in triathlon, she was telling me they were making tens of thousands of pounds sometimes at races. I was like, wow, there's nothing like that in gymnastics. And it gave me a bit of hope that something like that could exist in the future within gymnastics. All it takes is somebody that's a big fan of a sport sometimes, and it's normally something different. It's normally the format is a little bit different, so it's a different format to the traditional gymnastics format. Big sponsors, there's lots of mascots, it's music, it's a big event, a big show, a bit like we had Declan James, the squash player, on recently, and he said, squash doesn't do a great job of marketing itself. It needs to put on a big event like snooker and pool and darts. Similar kind of thing, I think, for gymnastics. So that's one thing I learned about triathlon that I really didn't know. There really is that opportunity to earn big money outside of just competing for Team GB and going to the Olympic Games. So that was one thing I learned from Sophie's story. So the marketing of the sport is really important, I think. Getting eyeballs on it makes a big difference, and that ultimately filters down to the athletes getting paid more money and there being more money in the system, and then being able to put more money, invest more money into the grassroots of the sport. So that marketing side of things is massive. It's super important, as well as just winning the medals. You need the medals, but I do think you need the marketing side of things as well. The key message I took away from Sophie's story was that you just have to start at the bottom. She told the story of her mum taking her to get a 50 quid bike from Halfords. She had none of the kit and she went and did her first triathlon. And, you know, it's just such a romantic story, isn't it? And that's how every sporting story seems to start. Everybody I get onto this podcast, they tell the same story. There's no way around it. That's the way it has to be. You have to start at the very beginning. And, you know, I've always been confused about how you get the sponsorship and the funding and the support and the money once you've made it, but you don't have it at the beginning when you really need it. But that's just the way it is, you know. I guess that's why you get that at the end, because if you are able to stay that course and make it through to, you know, making your senior debut, representing your country, that's when you get the fruits of your labour, because you've been able to stick it out. And, you know, that support, I think, from parents has been massive. That's come across, making sure you've got a good support network. I don't think it's possible without that. You know, a lot of these sports as well, financially are tough, so you need a lot of financial backing from parents. Local councils are really good for sponsoring people. But yeah, from Sophie's story, just hearing that, I think straight away everybody that listened to that clip and listened to the podcast was imagining themselves when they were a kid and when they started doing sport and what it'd be like, and the story of making it all the way from that 50 quid bike in Halfords and doing your first triathlon and not having any kit, all the way to potentially competing at Olympic Games. It's just an amazing story, right? And that's the way it has to be. And, you know, I had an experience of that at the start of this year when I started my first gymnastics sessions, and, you know, I'm there, Olympian, done gymnastics for 21 years, and I had 3 kids in my first session. I was like, this is the way it should be, man. Starting from the bottom, you know. You'd think you'd just have 10 kids straight away, but I've not proved it yet. I've got to put in the work and put in the grind and gain that credibility and build that trust with the parents, so the word gets out and they start recommending me to other parents, and then the kids come, the kids enjoy it, they tell their friends at school, and it takes time. Like, good things take time, and that was a big thing that I took away from Sophie's story, you know, that there is no way of getting around it. You have to start at the bottom and put in that grind and that graft when nobody's watching. The other thing that I thought about after speaking to Sophie is just that where the Paris Olympics is coming up, and that Paris qualification is just around the corner. And I know right now there'll be a lot of athletes that are preparing for an Olympic year. And the pressure and the stress of an Olympic year is like nothing else when you're an athlete. You know, it really is. The atmosphere just switches. It's almost like January the 1st, that first training camp when you meet up with everybody else in your sport. It's just, the gears go up, the volume's turned up, and it really is like walking into a pressure cooker. So it got me thinking about the athletes that are going to go and be part of that next year, part of that preparation, whether they're successful or not successful, is still a massive thing in their life. So really thinking about that. The athletes that have been on the podcast and are hoping to go to the Olympic Games, you know, I wish them all the best. I'm going to be following all of their journeys. It's going to be really interesting for me to see who makes it in the end, who doesn't, what they decide to do after that process, whether they've been successful or not, and follow their stories. Hopefully the podcast in some ways will provide some value. You know, we've had a lot of Olympians on that have been to the Games, they've retired now, and they've shared their experiences. So hopefully, it's going to be an exciting year with lots of athletes that we've got on attempting to compete in Olympic Games, and if we get to watch some of them there, it would just be absolutely incredible. So I wish them all the best, and I wish Sophie the best into the new year. I know she's on her off season now, so she finished the tour season, which was that lucrative tour that they go on, and she was pretty successful in that, I think, and now she'll be having her off season, getting ready for next year. But yeah, just wishing Sophie the best for next year. I think one thing as well that happened after the podcast with Sophie, which was I tried to convince her to go out and watch her husband Tom race. He's an ultramarathon runner, and actually that weekend that she went out, he ended up getting really ill and ended up in hospital, got lost for, I think it was like over 10 hours, got lost, ended up in hospital. Since then, he went to race in South Africa and got mugged and had to pull out of that race. So there's a lot, I'm sure, has happened in a lot, and it's just a good, accurate representation, right? Even when you're an athlete or if you've got your job in a career, you never know what someone's going through. Everybody's always going through stuff, man. I know that I am right now. I know that Sam will be. I know that everybody in my life will be going through their stuff. So, yeah, that's one thing I've taken away from that as well. And hopefully, like, he's okay. And, yeah, just wish him the best for the new year. The next person that I'm going to talk about is Ellie. So the Ellie Downey episode was great for me. It was the first time I had a female gymnast on the podcast. It's something I really wanted to do, particularly with everything that's happened within the culture of gymnastics in the last few years. And Ellie's story was a remarkable one. I think the thing I learned about Ellie's story that probably upset me the most and was probably why people resonated with it was just that story she told of being at the Olympic trials. You know, she'd been through all of those setbacks and the injuries. She got herself back to that position and she sat there in a sports hall in Cardiff. She had to pull out of the Olympic trial. She knew her Olympic dream was going to be over. She sat on a chair with her head in her hands and nobody came over to talk to her. And I just, I think like me, most people were there seeing that play out because she told the story so well. And it's hard not to see that when someone tells you that story. And I'm closing my eyes and I can see her there in the chair and I'm wanting to go over and just put my arm around her. And I think that lack of empathy really is the thing that I learned about that, and particularly from her story. I think there really is a difference between the men's side and the women's side. Now, don't get me wrong, there's stuff that goes on in men's gymnastics that's not okay. We spoke about a lot of that on the podcast and things that do need to change. But I think on the women's side, I don't know whether it's because I've got younger sisters or not, but it really gets to me a bit more. And I think it's because generally speaking, the girls are a lot younger. And the one thing about that really still puzzles me is that the head national coach there that, was part of a lot of that process, and was the guy that sent an email out after that, included Ellie in the email after the World Championships when she hadn't been selected, which just think is gobsmacking. He would come up to me in the gym, that guy, and he would always say hello, shake my hand, talk to me, ask me how I was doing. And it really puzzles me then that he wasn't able to, take that empathy and that ability to come over and have a conversation with me and talk to me. Somebody that's not part of his program, is in a completely different sport, is a different gender, give me his 5 minutes. Why I wasn't able to do that in those moments and show that empathy. And I don't know whether that's something to do with being in a position where you have to make tough decisions and maybe you don't want to do that. But yeah, for me, that puzzled me, that did, after listening to Ellie's story. And, I think it comes down to just a little bit of empathy, man. Like, if someone's been through that their whole life, I think it's not hard to go over and just ask them if they're okay, or even just give them a phone call, man. So that was the one thing that I took away from that really upset me. And I'd like to say it's a rare story, but it's really not. Having spoken to quite a few gymnasts on this podcast and other athletes, it seems to be a common theme, that real lack of empathy and just putting yourself in somebody else's shoes that is just doesn't exist within gymnastics. And I think that is something that definitely needs to change. I don't know whether it's because there's a big divide in age. So you've got adults coaching kids. I don't know whether it's that. Maybe it is. But a lot of these young men and women were certainly adults when a lot of these conversations took place. So that was a big thing. And when it comes to the culture, I think there have been some changes, even since we did that episode with Ellie. So British Gymnastics have just come out with some new legislation that says that nobody under the age of 12 can now be taken out of school to do gymnastics, which I think is an amazing thing. For me, that's super positive. When I think back to my original video that I put out back in 2020 when this stuff kind of happened and people started to speak about their experiences in gymnastics, one of the things that I put forward was that I don't think anybody should be taken out of school under the age of 16 to do gymnastics. I just don't think they need to do that. I think you can get the same results by working outside of school times. So that's a massive positive for me. And I think under the age of 16, from what I understand, it's now up to the school whether they let the kids come out of school to do gymnastics. But under 12, nobody's allowed to do that. The other thing that's changed, which is really good, and again, I don't know why this outdated practice was allowed up until this point, is that they're taking weighing scales out of gyms, and I think kids under the age of 16 can't be weighed anymore, which is just a no-brainer. I mean, the eating disorders associated with gymnastics are just through the roof, and that goes for men and women. And you should never, ever be putting a 10-year-old kid on a set of weighing scales. Like, that is just bonkers. So I'm glad that that's ancient history, and hopefully all of the gyms adhere to that. And if that process or practice carries on, I'd like to think there's people out there now that would say something, speak up and put an end to that, because that's just not okay. Not just for the gymnastics, do you know what I mean? Just for later in life, because those things last. They really do. They stay with you for the whole of your life. So that's a good thing that's come out of the last few years within gymnastics, within the culture, and I'm glad to see those changes are taking place. And I think the key message that I took away from Ellie was that like your self-worth and your value is really important. And I think Ellie ultimately got to the point where she was like, do you know what? I'm worth more than this. I don't need people treating me like this in these situations. Like, this isn't okay. I'm going to take myself out of this environment because I don't want to be in it anymore. And she made that decision to retire at quite a young age. I think she was 23, 24. She walked away from the sport and now she looks super happy. It was great speaking to her. She's moving on to new things. I think she's filmed a TV show. She's out in America at the moment. Working on her personal training, so it's just amazing to see that she's in a good place. After all of that, all you want for someone is that they find a bit of peace and also they can move on to the next chapter of their life. Be proud of their achievements, because she was incredible, the things that she achieved in her career, but, be able to kind of leave that to one side now and move on to the next chapter. So that was brilliant to see. But yeah, the Ellie episode was brilliant, and I really hope I can get some more female gymnasts on in the future to share their stories too. The next episode I'm going to talk about is the Lewis one. So this was our episode that probably did, I think it did the best in the first 7 days of release. So it got the most downloads, most listens, and it was just a fascinating conversation. Look, I knew it was going to be. He had an incredibly interesting story. I think the thing that I learned from Lewis's story that I didn't know at the time were probably those conversations he had with the powers that be. And again, it's kind of echoes similar to Dan's story. That conversation Lewis had where he was told that, okay, we're going to put you in the Commonwealth Games. Please, can you, we'd like you to compete in the Europeans, but actually we want you to compete in the Commonwealth Games. Oh, sorry, it was the other way around. So Lewis wanted to compete in the Commonwealth Games to make his comeback. They actually sat him down at a competition at a British Championships and said, right, Lewis, we'd like you to compete at the Europeans because we need you in the team. We need your score. For us, in terms of Olympic qualification and just the whole future moving forward, this is a more important event for us. And in gymnastics as well, it goes Olympic Games, World Championships, European Championships, then Commonwealth Games. So Lewis says, yeah, no problem. Does well in the competition. Next day, they select a completely different team and put him on the Commonwealth Games team. And he's like, what on earth is going on? So I think those conversations Lewis was having throughout the whole of his career with the powers that be was just something that I was just never privy to, obviously. I never really had those conversations, If I did have a conversation, it was just in a gymnastics gym setting, just on the side, and it wasn't these big decisions that were being made. So, it now makes sense to me, some of the situations that kind of came about and the way Lewis reacted to certain things make a lot more sense having listened to his story and the conversations that he was having. So for me, again, just a new perspective. It's great to learn from other people's stories, and it certainly does, misconceptions or ideas you've got about what somebody did or their story or how they reacted in a certain situation. Context is really important. So to be able to sit down and hear his story, for me, it was great. And I'm sure a lot of people on the outside felt that way as well, especially about the stuff that happened post-Rio 2016. You really only got one side of the story, and there always is two, right? So it was great to hear from Lewis that way. I think the key message I took away from Lewis's episode for me was certainly his mindset. I just thought his mindset and his self-belief and the way he talked about never letting anybody else determine his future. So he never let anybody pigeonhole him into just being a pommel horse specialist or just being this person. He was kind of like, no, I can be what I want to be. And that real strong focus and mindset was just the real thing that I took away from that. I think the best story probably told, and the one that I could really envisage and see inside my head the most, was when he was talking about being at the Olympic Games, and he's talking about the cameras flashing and knowing everybody on the other side of the camera lens, because there have been journalists that had followed him for years, and knowing all of the judges and the people in the crowd and the noise and the royalty and teammates and all of that, and then being able to know that in that moment, in that extreme situation, he had done all the work and prepared himself so he was able to press that autopilot button. I mean, I've never heard anybody explain it that way. It was brilliant. It really like resonated with me. I took that away, and it's something that I've spoke about with other people since, and it's something that I'll never forget. Doing the work and preparing so that you can press the autopilot button in those moments of pressure, and like just again, and you can see a common thread here: the hard work, consistency, doing the work that nobody sees, starting from the bottom. That is the secret. There's no magic trick. So that was a real key message I took away from Lewis's story. It was that self-belief. And I think that's probably the big thing that separates the good from the great, is that real, just unshakable self-confidence. And I really got that from Lewis and listening to his story. I think Lewis is now, what it got me to thinking about was probably that in gymnastics right now, I don't think we have any big personalities. I'm missing that. The sport needs big personalities. You had Fabian Hambuchen when I was growing up, huge personality. You got Lewis when he was around. I think we're now missing those big personalities, and I think you need that in sport. You need the people that are winning the medals 100%, and you need big personalities. I like that in sport. It's entertainment, right? Like, if Conor McGregor's fighting, I'm watching because it's going to be fun and exciting no matter what happens. Mike Tyson's going to say some crazy stuff. Do you know what I mean? So, like, you need that, and I think the sport of gymnastics needs some big personality, so hopefully they can come out in the next few years. That'd be great. I'd love to see that. And all those people with those big personalities, I think a misconception you maybe would have with Lewis is, from the outside, is that he's a big personality and he just does the pommel horse and he maybe doesn't put the work in. That's never true. Those people do put the big work in. So yeah, that's one thing I think that's missing at the minute from our sport. I'd like to see some big personalities in it. And Lewis at the minute, he's performing in the pantomime in Lincoln, in Aladdin. I messaged him, asked him what he was up to. So that's until January the 7th. So if you're in and around Lincoln, you can go and watch him. I'm sure you will see Lewis do some gymnastics at that panto. I'm sure that will be weaved into his performance somehow. But yeah, it's been great to listen to his story. Also see the reaction back from it. And hopefully, yeah, our paths will cross again in the future, and I wish him all the best into the new year. The next person I'm going to talk about is Frank. I think potentially my favourite episode. A lot of people have messaged me and said the same thing. Frank's story is just unbelievable, and I think the thing I learned about Frank's story was just how many injuries he had, but also how many times he was the reserve. I don't think I can think of another gymnast that was a reserve as many times as Frank was, being that guy that just misses out, right? It's one thing being a reserve and sitting at home and watching it on TV, but being a reserve and being there and having to watch it in the actual stadium, that's tough. And maybe the first time and the second time, you can take that, you can handle it, because you can still see a future where you could be on the team. But for Frank to have got to the point where he was told, look, we want to put you on the team, but we can't put you on it because imagine what that would look like. I mean, that inspired some kind of anger within me. That made me so angry, Frank is just one of the hardest workers you'll ever meet, an incredible guy, 100% commitment, and to have people playing with his future like that, that really upset me, and it took me back to my experiences back in 2016 around that time, and it was sad to know that kind of stuff was going on still past that time. That was another 2 or 3 years after that, and so that for me was learning about just the injuries and the setbacks that he had and how he never stopped. He always kept going. And he always put other people first. He always did that. He had that conversation where he rang up Courtney. Courtney, we had him on the podcast. He said, look, Courtney, do you want to be a reserve, mate? Because I'm not fit and I'm not healthy. And Courtney said, look, I'm going to get myself fit, quite rightly so, and look after myself, get ready for next year. And Frank was like, all right, I'll do it then. And he goes and he does that and he puts all the work in. I've been a reserve. You do everything but compete. Now, you might not have that pressure on your shoulders because you ultimately know I'm not going to have to put my hand up, but you do all the work, and he did all of that. Then on the day where the coaches said to the gymnast, you can have a day off, and his teammate James Hall says, look, I want to go and train because I don't feel good if I don't train. Frank says, I'll go with you so you're not on your own. He does the warm-up and he sits down, and there's a coach there that says to him, why did we even bring you? We should have brought someone else. That is just it's an awful thing to say. And I think what I've learned is that everybody has their limit. It doesn't matter how strong or tough you are, how much on the outside you act like it doesn't affect you. The things that people say, it does. It goes in, it registers. And I think with Frank, for so long, he just kept all of it. He just kept going and stored it all up here. And it just got to the point where he'd had enough. And I think that's why Frank retired the first time, and he retired with a lot of resentment, a lot of anger and frustration. And I completely understand that. And I think that's why people resonated with that story so much. And I think one thing that's really important that came out of that episode for me is never underestimate your ability to have a positive impact on somebody's life. You have a choice, right? That coach could have sat there and he could have said, hey, Frank, well done, mate, for coming to support your teammate and doing all of this build-up, even though we asked you last minute, you've done all the work, you're injured. Like, it's amazing that you've done that. And, I'm going to support you and I'm going to help you next year to try and get back to your best. Whatever you need, just ask. In that moment, he could have said that, and that would have made Frank feel like $100 million, right? And instead, he chose to say to him, why did we even bring you? We should have brought someone else. And that massively upsets me, obviously, because I care about Frank. He's one of my good friends. And there's no way, you can't sugarcoat that. There's no grey area. It's pretty black and white. That's just not okay. I'm sorry that Frank had to go through that experience, but sharing his experience like that, hopefully, will prepare the next generation of kids coming through to know, to kind of understand, right, when those conversations are happening with the powers that be or people that are in a position to maybe make a decision, don't always take it for gospel, Make sure that you kind of strip back those layers of naivety slowly, gradually over time, so that you make the best decisions for yourself. That was the big thing that came out of that, I think, for me. But Frank, what a guy, man. That video did really well online. It got over 50,000 views. A lot of people commenting, messaging on it and engaging with it. And I think the great thing is that Frank is just such an awesome guy. And one thing I do take away from Frank, honestly, when you spend some time with Frank and you're around him, it just makes you feel good, man. He's so positive. And I think often in life, the people that have been dealt the difficult hand often turn out to be that way. You have a choice, right? And they choose to be happy and positive. And what an amazing guy. He's running a marathon at Christmas. He's running the Liverpool Marathon. He's raising money for Mind and the mental health charity. Last month, I did 28 days without coffee, which I'm super proud of. I've never gone that long before without coffee, and it was actually okay. The only thing that changed was I just had mad dreams. I was just having these crazy dreams, man, like every night. It was great. It was mental. And even normally you drift back off and you kind of remember, even if I shut my eyes, I was just dreaming again. So that was the big thing that came out of not drinking coffee for 28 days. But, my idea was for every day I do, I'll donate £1 to Frank's GoFundMe page. So I'm going to put the link in the description on YouTube to this episode, but also I'm going to share it on social media as well. So yeah, if you can share some money for Frank, it's for a good cause, for mental health, it's for Mind. And he's running a marathon, which is pretty cool, man. So it's just great to see someone like that that's got that story that, could have potentially spent the rest of his life feeling pretty down and like the victim, and he's chose to channel that into something positive. And yeah, honestly, you spend 5 minutes with Frank and all of a sudden you feel like you can take on the world. So just an incredible guy, and definitely one of my favorite conversations we had on a podcast. And I guess the last thing I'm going to talk about is a video that went out a couple of weeks ago that went viral. So when I post videos onto social media from the podcast and I put clips up, whenever I use social media, I post and then I delete the app. So I think I posted this on a Friday and then deleted the app until the Sunday. So then I downloaded Instagram on a Sunday and boom, it's kicking off. I'm like, whoa, what's happened here? So it was a clip taken from a big, long podcast, and that podcast was all about the greatest of all time in gymnastics. And I talked about an idea I've had since I was a child, which was, I wonder what would happen if you'd take all the Olympic champions from every sport and get them to compete against each other. And it's of my opinion that the gymnast will have the best chance of being able to do the fundamentals and the basics in all of those sports in comparison to the other athletes being able to do the gymnastics. Now, I think a lot of people confused that and thought that I meant that the gymnast could compete at an Olympic level. Definitely not. Like, there's no way that they could. But the big thing I think I took away from that was, number one, there's a lot of angry people out there, which is quite funny. Number two, it was great because it just got people debating, because it's an interesting conversation. It's like, wow, what would happen? Because we've never seen that. And it was really, really cool to see different ideas. I think I've learned that probably the top of that list that people think, other than gymnastics, because there's a lot of gymnastics people that do think gymnastics is the best fundamental sport, and that's from people that aren't in a gymnastics background as well. There's a lot of people that disagreed with that. But the big two that came out were decathlon, which makes sense, right? 10 sports in athletics. You've got to throw, jump, run. So yeah, that certainly must be up there. And wrestling. Wrestling was a big one. And, I started watching UFC about 5 or 6 years ago, and all of the people from different fractions of martial arts all say that wrestlers are like the toughest. And I actually had the chance to coach somebody with a wrestling background that works in MMA as an MMA coach at gymnastics one-on-one. And he can do handstands and cartwheels. I was teaching him to do handsprings. So he definitely, picked that up really fast, and they do a lot of gymnastics. And the reason he came to train with me was because he said, I want to start doing some gymnastics movements when I'm coaching my athletes, and I want to learn them. So he came to do some gymnastics with me. And interestingly, I went back and did a one-on-one session with him. So wrestlers as well are up there. And I think for me, like I said, the big thing I've taken away from that is it was the first opportunity I had to put into practice what I preach with people, is that, when you put something out there online, you've got to take the good with the bad, And it was the first opportunity for me to do that, because it was the first time something went viral. I think it's had nearly 600,000 views. It's had nearly 15,000 likes. It's had over 2,000 people comment on it. A lot of those people commenting are professional athletes. And I can see why people would take offense at me saying something like that. But again, it's just a clip taken from a 50-minute podcast, and out of context, it can look quite polarizing. I think the cool thing about it was that it wasn't meant to be that. I didn't expect it to go viral. It was just authentically a clip from a podcast that I put out of my opinion. I think what people need to learn from that is that it's okay to have your opinion. That's my opinion, man. You can have yours. If you don't agree with it, it's fine. There's nothing wrong with that, and it's cool. I want to encourage debate on this podcast. I had Lewis comment on one of the early podcasts, completely disagreeing with one of the points I made, and then he came on and we did a podcast. That's okay, man. It's okay to disagree with people, and it's great that it sparked this debate, and it's actually given me some real inspiration and ideas. And I think next year, one thing I really want to potentially explore is looking at doing some documentaries with other athletes from other sports and showcasing just how difficult their sports are, and talking to them, asking about their stories, looking at their training, potentially seeing if there's an element of their training that I can join in with. Not to make me look great, but to make them look great and me look bad. And I think that's going to be really important, because when you watch sport on the TV, right, I can be guilty of this myself. I'm a football fan. You can call football players and athletes and coaches every name under the sun and think they're stupid and don't know what they're doing, but then actually doing it is a different story. So yeah, I want to try and put my money where my mouth is a little bit and go out there and try some different sports next year. I think that'd be really cool. I've always said if I could ever do something where I get paid to do other sports, that's my dream job. So that's probably the big thing that I took away from that experience of that video going viral. And yeah, still people comment on it today. Hopefully some of those athletes would be able to come onto the podcast and debate me and we can talk about it. That'd be brilliant. I'd love that. But yeah, more than anything, it's been an amazing year. I've loved doing the podcast. I'm really proud of the work. I know Sam is as well. We put a lot of time and energy into it. So we appreciate everybody that supports it, and hopefully that comes across, you know. It's not something that we just turn up, we switch the camera on, we press record and we do. Like, there's a lot of planning. There's a lot that goes into the editing process, particularly from Sam's side. And yeah, we care about it. So we want it to be good. Next year, we want it to get bigger. We want to have bigger guests. We want to have more conversations. Like I said, I think we're going to look at exploring the YouTube space again and having some visual content for people specifically on YouTube. But yeah, we just want to keep it going. I think, you know, when we sat down at the start of the year, we said if we can do a year. I think I said 6 months and Sam said 1 year. And we're nearly there, right? We're nearly at 50 episodes. So let's see if we can get to 100 next. But yeah, thank you for supporting the podcast. We really appreciate it. Like always, I say this, but if you could subscribe, whether you listen to it on Spotify, Apple, even on YouTube, a lot of people just watch it on YouTube. Subscribing makes a big difference to us. If you leave us a review as well, I'm going to spend some time over Christmas going through the reviews of the podcast and getting back to people. Engage with it, communicate with us, tell us what guests you want to have on, what conversations. And yeah, just more than anything, thank you for supporting us for the first 50 episodes. And I can't wait for the next 50. Thank you.